Good evening all, and welcome. There are certainly creepy people in this world, and we are about to become better acquainted with a handful of them. So get ready, because it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I'm a 29-year-old female, and my partner is a 23-year-old female. We're back in her hometown visiting her family for about a week. It's a very small, isolated town in the middle of nowhere, and basically in the middle of the woods. While we were here, she wanted to meet up with an old high school friend who still lives in the area, Kyle. We met Kyle at the beach, and right away, he's acting super weird, making jokes that are highly inappropriate and unwelcome. Obviously, we're unfortunately used to this stuff to a certain extent, but coming from someone who was supposed to be her good friend, it was extra annoying. So me and my girlfriend were shooting each other panicked looks the whole time. Once he's out of earshot for a second, she says that she's sorry and that she's never seen him be like this before, and that we can make an excuse to leave. When he comes back, we tell him we want to get dinner at a local bar, but he just asks to join us. We felt awkward and ended up saying yes. He says he doesn't know quite how to get there, so he followed us. We get there, order drinks and food, and then head out to the patio with the drinks. He makes a few more gross comments, but is generally being way more cool than normal than he was at the beach. We're smoking on the patio and just chilling. The food arrives, we finish it quicker, and here's where it gets really messed up. Halfway through my first drink, I'm feeling really tired, which makes sense as I've had a long day. I give my girlfriend that signal that I want to go, and she makes an excuse that we need to leave. He keeps trying to get us to come to his house. I've got some really good stuff, and you can meet my cats, blah blah blah. He's being really pushy. We keep saying no and making excuses, and that we need to check on her grandpa. So finally we get into the car and say goodnight. We've parked next to each other and walked up to the cars together while saying our goodbyes. When we get in the car, my girlfriend informs me that she wants to stay at the bar, but fake it like we're leaving because she doesn't want to chill with him anymore, understandably. So we're sitting in the car waiting for him to leave first when he signals for us to roll down the window. We do. He says his GPS is being funny, and can we lead him to the main road? To be fair, we were in the middle of nowhere, so this didn't seem too outlandish, so obviously staying behind the bar was out at that point. In the car, we're talking about just how pushy he was being, and how she admits she feels strange driving right back to her grandparents' house, so we should drive into town until we lose him. He's behind us for a long time, even way after he should have gotten off his exit. We think it's weird, but aren't really sure what to do. Finally, we get onto a 2-lane road, and he pulls up next to us and is waving a phone, which is clearly my girlfriend's phone, in the window. We pull over, he gives her the phone back, chats for a few seconds, and then leaves in a hurry. Here's the part that makes my skin crawl. We knew she had her phone. I saw her put it in her fanny pack on the table along with my phone and a few other things a few minutes before we left the bar, as we were preparing to leave. She didn't take it back out. There's literally no way she could have left it at the bar. More importantly, he got into his car and left the bar at the same time as us, meaning he had to have already had the phone when we were leaving. It's not like we left the bar in the first place and he saw it was left on the table or something. He literally had to have been walking to the cars with us and calmly saying goodnight with the phone already in his possession. Now the kicker. Apparently, unbeknownst to me, my girlfriend has tasted a very weird bitter taste in her straw at the bar, and was already suspicious, especially with how he'd been acting. This is why she wanted us to stay at the bar to get away from him and stay in public where she felt safer. So when he walked up to the car to return her cell phone, she very casually and deliberately flashed the knife that she kept for protection in her jacket. I didn't know at the time that she had done this, so that's why he had left so quickly. Obviously, I was annoyed with her for not telling me her suspicions sooner, but she just didn't want me to panic. I'm really shaken up. A few things are clear though. He stole my girlfriend's phone, and it seems like he did that so we would be forced to pull over on a dark road in the middle of nowhere. He also ended the conversation and left when my girlfriend flashed her weapon, and they've been good friends for almost 10 years. If he wasn't planning on doing something malicious, I feel he would have acted confused about the weapon, or said something like, "Lol, what are you doing?" But instead he booked it, which tells me he knew exactly what she was doing, reacting to a threat and preparing to protect herself and me. Finally, he probably spiked our drinks. My girlfriend noticed a weird taste in her straw right away and chose not to finish her drink. I half finished mine and felt very tired. I don't know how he managed to nab the phone without us knowing or noticing. It doesn't really make sense, but he did. Me and my girlfriend both remember her putting it in the fanny pack perfectly. We also have no idea how he could have spiked our drinks unless he was working with the bartender, but we were the ones who suggested that bar. I don't know exactly how he did it, but I think I know why. And for that reason, my girlfriend's now ex-friend who made creepy comments and probably tried to spike our drinks and stole her phone in order to get us alone on a dark road, let's not meet again. I grew up in a small town and could walk and play a couple of blocks from home, but only with the company of one of my older brothers, and later our family dog, a super protective Rottweiler mix when I was older. I was never allowed to leave the house by myself because my parents didn't want anything happening to me. There was a well-known neighborhood creep, probably 60 or so in age, that lived alone in a house on the street adjacent to ours. In the house next to his lived a couple that were good neighbors and great friends of my parents. Their name were the Smiths. They were about the same age as my parents and loved children, but they couldn't have any of their own. My parents had 7 biological kids and 4 non-biological. I was the youngest. There were a few incidents where I remember running into the neighborhood creep. One being when I was at the corner of the gas station with one of my brothers when he came up behind me and smelled my hair and told my brother that I was cute. Another time when I was riding with my dad in his truck and the guy flagged down my dad and asked him if I was my dad's wife, and I was 10 at the time. He was a major creep, but there is one incident that will always stick with me. Me and my siblings would occasionally go over to the Smiths' house because they were really nice, loved us, and would let us swim in their pool as we didn't have one. They would also pay us for doing small odd jobs. They sometimes would watch me for my parents, as most of my siblings were teenagers with a lot of extracurricular activities. One day, my brother and I went over to the Smith's house. My brother was in charge of watching me that day, and Mr. Smith offered my brother some money to help him move some stuff out of the front of their house for a yard sale, and to help them sell things. While the yard sale was going on, I was sitting on their front porch playing with my Barbie doll. A few people had come and gone. My brother and Mr. Smith went inside to go through more things to sell, and Mrs. Smith was busy trying to help someone to buy things. Then came along neighborhood creep. He looks around a bit, trying to seem interested in buying stuff, then came up to me, bent down, touched my hair and said, "How much for you?" I was incredibly shy as a child, and occasionally burst into tears even when someone waved at me that was unfamiliar. The man literally made me pee my pants. I immediately started crying and screaming repeatedly for my brother. Mr. Smith and my brother came running out, and all I remember was my brother picking me up and carrying me home, while Mr. Smith tried to figure out what happened. Since almost a year now, at the end of August 2019 to be exact. I have moved to an apartment in a different city because my mother, who I lived with in my hometown, passed away from cancer. I have moved here with my long-term boyfriend and one other roommate, who has been a very good friend to both of us since before we had even started dating. We all absolutely love it here. The location is great. It's a 15-minute bike ride from my university and is located at a square with a grocery store, drugstore, lunchrooms, etc. So we pretty much have everything we could possibly need to survive within walking distance. However, after just a month of living here, someone has started to ring the doorbell at exactly 11:05 p.m. semi-regularly, sometimes every day, sometimes every other day. Sometimes there's a week in between, and sometimes there's a couple of weeks in between. But it's always at around 11:05 p.m. And every single time, I get no answer each time I ask through the intercom who it is. Except for once, but I'll get to that soon enough. At first, I thought it were friends from one of the neighbors who accidentally rang the wrong doorbell. But after the fourth time I grew suspicious. And after more than those 4 times, I started noticing that it always happened at either exactly or around 11:05 p.m. My boyfriend and roommate both work at bars, and so they work until very late and would usually get in at around 2 a.m. So each time it happened, I was always alone at home, and it started to really freak me out after a while. When I first told them about it, they kind of shrugged it off and said that it was probably a wrong dial, like I thought at first. But when I told them that it had happened so many times, and sometimes even daily, they didn't believe me and thought I was just a little paranoid and spooked. However, one night when the doorbell rang again, and I answered the intercom asking who it was, I heard very heavy breathing. I was thoroughly spooked at that moment. I was again home alone and kept asking who they were and what they wanted. I couldn't make out from the breathing if it was a man or woman, but I heard a strange mumbling and then it was dead silent, as they had appeared to have left. I had put my apartment door on a double lock after that. I was so scared and spooked out, and thankfully my roommate got home a little earlier that night, around 30 minutes after the doorbell rang, and he could tell how upset I was. Now with the coronavirus, my roommate and boyfriend aren't able to work anymore, and they now also witnessed the frequent door ringing at 11:05, so they now do believe me, and I agree that it's very odd and creepy. We have a balcony that looks down to where our apartment building's main front door is, but because there's also a shop right underneath us that always has those curtain/roof things out, the view to the door is partially obscured. Every time our doorbell rang, me, my boyfriend and roommate would go to the balcony to see if we could see anyone, but we never could. I have also asked my neighbors from my apartment if their doorbell also gets rang so often, but the ones that I asked said it never happened to them. So 2 weeks ago, my roommate decides to do some investigating and went outside our apartment building at 11 p.m. He stands across the street and pretended to have a smoke while keeping an eye on the door. He said he saw a man who looked kind of suspicious wandering around our apartment building, who slowed down his pace significantly as soon as he approached our door. But when he spotted my roommate looking at him, he quickly walked away. We aren't certain if this is the door ringer, but it certainly was very suspicious. Our doorbell hasn't been rung at night since that day, and I'm hoping that maybe it will stop now. But there is a possibility that it will start again in the next few weeks. If this keeps up, I will contact the police about it. I've been planning to ask more neighbors from other apartments next to ours if this is also happening to them. If it doesn't, I will call the cops. I however doubt that they'll do anything right now, since the coronavirus and all. The police will only respond to serious crimes or immediate threatening situations. In any case, creepy guy, let's not meet again. This happened back in 2016 on Christmas Eve night. We had just gotten back from my sister's and were sitting in the car for a few minutes. It was fairly cold. Keep this in mind. Also, side note, we had a bunch of cats, so at first we hadn't thought anything of it. We sat there for about 10 minutes and heard rustling. Not thinking anything about it because of the cats, we blew it off. When not a minute later we heard it again. My mum just so happened to look up, and there was a bald man in a vest and shorts. My mum and I both had that uneasy feeling because of his choice of clothing. It was 32 degrees, and he's in summertime clothes. Very strange. My mum has her window cracked, and he was barely a foot away from our car. My mum yelled out to him and said to back away from the vehicle, which surprisingly he didn't. He continued to stand there and stare at us. My mum decided to try and scare him, so she yelled out to him that she was armed and would blow him away. She didn't have her firearm on her though. She definitely made sure he thought he did. He threw up his hands but continued to approach the car, so my mum threw her phone to me and told me to dial 911. I told the dispatcher what was going on, and she said she'd have the police there right away. My mother proceeded to try and run him down, but he went between two porches so that our car wouldn't fit. Finally, about half hour later, the cops show up and took our statement. The station, bear in mind, was literally down the road, and if he'd actually have tried something, I knew his intentions were ill-willed, even if he had run away. So I was very annoyed that cops took so long to show up. They stayed and looked everywhere for him, but it came out empty. My mum nor I slept that night, or finished opening presents because of the fear he would return. The police thought maybe he wanted to steal the gifts that were in the car, but we'll never know. The scariest part is months later, it came to light he had escaped jail. He was put there for assault, so who knows what he would have done to my mother and I. I have an 100-pound German Shepherd who's pretty friendly. So while walking him in my neighborhood one day, this guy comes running up to me and accuses me of being a cop because I have such a large cop-like dog. Not realizing the level of crazy I was about to be exposed to, I politely said no and continued to walk my dog. This continued to escalate over the next few weeks. Every time I saw this guy, he would accuse me of being a cop, following behind me and constantly babbling about he knew I was there to take his stash, and if I just would follow him into his house, he would show them to me. Then one day I start to notice he apparently is now camping out all night long in the playground outside my house, while swinging a sock with a rock in it. At this point I had called the cops, and they told me there was nothing they could do. It only got worse after that. Every time I left my house to go to my car, which was parked out in front of my house, he would come running from the playground or from the front stoop of his house screaming that he knew I was a cop, and that I couldn't catch him. So I called the cops again. They came out to talk to the family and said he apparently is very disturbed and there isn't anything they can do. The final straw was when he decided to yell veiled death threats into his cell phone while running to beat me to my car while I left for work one day. When I told the cops and told them about the death threats, they showed up in force, arrested him, as apparently he was wanted for various things. As a child, think kindergarten age, I loved to talk. If anyone had a question for me, I would gleefully give them way too much information. Most people found it endearing and would praise me for being so smart, which encouraged me a lot. My mum and I normally shopped at the market just a few minutes away from our house. My mum had been shopping there for 20-some years at that point, and I was friends with most of the workers. so I was friendly with them too, and, as always, was happy to talk to them. Whenever my mum got distracted talking to someone, I, with the attention span of a 6-year-old, would wander around the aisle. My mum would keep an eye to make sure I didn't get too far, but if she was distracted, one of the employees would usually be around and gently guide me back over. One day though, we went to a different market that I couldn't remember having been to before, and we didn't go back to for nearly a decade. We were walking around the aisles when my mum ran into her friend. They started talking, and I, not realizing that I no longer had a store full of adults keeping an eye on me, started wandering around the aisle. My eye caught some colourful display, I think flowers or balloons or something, and I went over to look. Once I was satisfied with my inspection, I turned back to the aisle only to find that my mum wasn't there. Strange, that never happened before. I looked around a little, although not moving from my spot near the colourful display, since it was right near the registers and there were a decent amount of people nearby, which I'm now thankful for. As I was looking around, an employee came up to me. He was older than my sister, as she was around 12 or 13 at the time, and younger than my dad in his mid-40s, which was about the only way I could gauge age. Now I would say he was probably in his early to mid-20s. "Hi there," he said sweetly, in that tone you normally speak to kids in. I cheerfully said hello, actually stepping a little closer. "Are you looking for your mummy?" I say yes, happily explaining that I had last seen her talking to her friend and that I could normally find her easily when I wandered away, so I wasn't sure where she could have gone. "Does she leave you alone often?" "Not really. My elder sister was normally with me if my mum wasn't. She was 12 and she was super mature, so if my mum had to leave me for a bit, she knew I'd be okay, and she never left us alone in public, just at home if she needed to run somewhere. And my dad was at work a lot and didn't come back until late usually, just if you were wondering." "Where do you live?" Well, wouldn't you know it, I'd even learned my address. We just learned how to mail a letter in school, and even took a little class trip to the mailbox on our school corner to send them out. I know how to write my address now, and I knew how to say it. Do you want to hear it? Of course you do. I know kids are naive, but I was downright dumb. I was diagnosed with digital colorblindness 2 years later, otherwise known as red-green colorblindness. Makes sense, as I was totally blind to all the red flags. "Where do you go to school? Who picks you up?" "Well, I go to the local elementary school. I don't know the address though, sorry, but I knew what street it was on because I walk the sidewalk from my mum's or daycare's sitter, depending on the day. So I see the street sign a lot since I'm usually waiting for a while to be grabbed." "Do you like animals? Do you like puppies?" "Dogs scare me, cats scare me, pigeons scare me, fish scare me, flies scare me. You know what doesn't scare me though? Turtles. I have 5. No dogs that might bark or bite if someone drops the house, like our neighbors does. The dogs are always behind the gate though, so they don't scare me a lot." I'd only been a few minutes since I last saw my mum, even with how much information I was dumping, as I was a fast talker. But I was starting to get a little antsy, not because I was uncomfortable speaking to strangers, but because I had skipped lunch that day, specifically to con my mum into letting me get a bagel from the store next door, which was why we were at the market in the first place. My mum was holding onto the bagel to make sure I didn't try and eat it too fast to choke, which I had done several times in the past. I wanted my bagel, and while I liked talking to this grown man who made me feel smart and was oh so interested in my life, I loved bagels more. Plus, if I caught my mom when we were near the bakery section, I might be able to use my charm and cuteness to get a cookie. So I gotta find my mum now. "Oh, well, I'll walk around with you to help you find her." "You want to lead me through the market you work at, where you can easily bring me to the back room, meat locker, or any number of places? Sounds good." That's when I heard it. "Ozzy." I look around to see my mum, the relieved look on her face slowly change into something more anxious. I smile happily and wave over to her. She immediately grabs my hand, and I can tell she wants to chide me, probably for leaving the aisle, but she seems more occupied on the man in front of me. Before I can even open my mouth to introduce him, or remember that I never got his name, he quickly says he's glad I found my mum, and he needs to get back to work, and practically runs to the back of the store. My mum puts her hand on my shoulder and looks me in the eye, her expression a lot more worried now. "What was he talking to you about?" she asks, her voice more serious than I'd ever heard. "Can I have my bagel?" My mum opens her mouth, pauses, and goes into her purse to hand me my bagel. Between bites, I happily tell her about the conversation and everything I remembered, my age, grades, pickup schedule, likes, dislikes, and my literal address. My mum gradually became paler, then became red with anger. She brought me over to the manager, and I don't remember much about that conversation. I got a cookie, I remember that pretty well. It was shaped like a watermelon, which was apparently far more important to me than paying attention to what was being said. The police weren't called. We went home, and my mum told me I wasn't allowed to walk around the store anymore. No more talking to any strangers, even if they worked at the store we were at, unless she was with me. If I ever saw that man again, I was to run away, to find someone I knew and ask for help. If all else fails, to scream at the top of my lungs, just like I would when a fly would land on me. God, insects are creepy. I agreed pleasantly, not really fazed by anything she said, and I know that some people are bad, but bad people look bad, right? They talk mean, they look scary and try to grab you. This guy didn't, so he wasn't bad, was he? But if my mum was saying it, then I'd listen. And I'd better enjoy that cookie because we weren't going back to that store ever again. In exchange, I can get a donut once a month from our annual store. When I was around 12, our school had a safety assembly, and we're talking about the shady things adults do to get kids close, and a very watered down version of what they most likely wanted. And I'm sitting there, listening, and suddenly realize, oh, if my mum hadn't found me, something bad might have happened. If not in the store, then in front of the school, and if not in the front of my school, then my home. A little over a decade later, and I've never seen the man again. Let's keep it that way. I'm a 22-year-old female, and this happened back when I was around 14. I was a freshman in high school, and I lived in Georgia. Every year in the fall, the fair comes to town. They have fun rides, booths where you can win prizes, and really good fair food everywhere. I usually go with my family, but this year I was going to meet up with my boyfriend and hang out with him and his friends. I arrive with my family and text my boyfriend to meet up. When I find him in the crowd, he pulled me aside and broke up with me. What a place to get dumped, right? Anyway, this was the end of the world to my 14-year-old self, and I definitely didn't want to return to my family. I was all alone and decided to sit down at a picnic table and cry. I had my head down and nobody was around me until this man approached. This man was older, 50 to 60-ish, a white, overweight male, stereotypical carny-looking worker. He sits down at the table I'm at, right next to me, and starts asking what's wrong. Now, I was a late bloomer, so when I was 14 I probably looked closer to 12. Being so upset, I told him that my boyfriend had just broken up with me. He puts his hands on my shoulder and tells me that he was sorry, and he would never dump me if he was with me. I didn't reply. He then tells me that he runs a booth over in the furthest corner of the fairground, and if I went to that booth, he would give me a free stuffed animal. He told me the type of booth he ran, but I can't remember what it was. Something like the water guns or something. He pointed me to where the booth was, which ended up being a really secluded corner. I said thanks, and that I might find him later. He exits. I get myself together, wipe the tears up, and go find my family again. We had a systematic way of going to every part of the fair to make sure that we got a good chance to ride everything. I walk around the entire fairground looking at every booth, especially the water gun one, and I never saw him. He was definitely not working one of them, because I would have seen his face and remembered him. I really wanted a stuffed animal, so I was disappointed that I never did find him. I never told my mum about it because I was really embarrassed to be dumped at the fair. Looking back on it now, I realized the dangerous situation that it could have led to. This man tried to lure me to a secluded corner of the fair to do God knows what. I'm glad I never got to see him. My mother, my sister and I had a day out a few cities over, so we were all generally in a good mood as we walked by some vandalized buildings to get to the back of the car. I think I may have been the one to spot him first. As far as I can remember, he was the only other person around aside from our group. He was dressed for the weather in shorts and a short-sleeved shirt and appeared normal. But after he caught sight of us, he almost immediately changed his trajectory towards us. I felt my mother stiffen slightly from where she stood beside me as he approached. Even if the memory wasn't slightly foggy from the passage of time, I still wouldn't be able to make out the things he said. As far as I could tell, he was shouting something about God at my mother before demanding to know if those girls were Catholics. My mother pushed us away from him slightly and stuttered out a response, clearly blindsided by the random question. My sister looked confused but stayed silent, and I took the opportunity to move slightly to the side so that there was more distance between me and this random guy who had shouted about God in my mother's face. The guy then shoved a small package into my sister and mother's hands while ignoring me completely. He shouted something like, "That's the word of the Lord on those leaflets there. You better read them, or I'll end you both." At that point, I was considering decking him in the face because he had shoved his own face way down close to my sister's to be any sort of comfortable. But my mother pushed her even further back while she hastily voiced her agreement. Seeming satisfied, the man walked off, but not before shouting more random things into my mother's face. She nodded and agreed with whatever he was saying, and as soon as he was out of sight, she placed a hand on both our backs and hurried us along. I remember thinking at the time that the things he had given them were clearly not leaflets, and I was proven right when my mother stopped walking after, and we were a good distance away and opened hers. She recoiled and abandoned it and got my sister to do the same. My mother thought it was tobacco, but my sister said it looked more like a particular hair. For being screamed at in her face by a random guy, she was rather nonplussed about the whole thing. As we were leaving the car, our mother caught sight of the same guy having an argument with another man. My sister and I both looked, and we got to bear witness as he climbed on top of a car and started stripping. Needless to say, we didn't stay there long after that. For background, my family moved to the countryside from the city when I was about 7, and I'm 21 now. Both my parents had grown up in the suburbs and had lived in the capital of our state for about 10 years before we moved. It definitely took us some time to get used to the train tracks that ran by our house, the wild animals, the weird but kind neighbors, and the odd visitors. Another thing is that you have to get off the main road and turn onto a long gravel driveway to get to our house. We can see the entire length of driveway from certain points in our yard, which is about 3 acres. A few years after we moved, my dad got a promotion at work, and as a result started to get conferences and business trips that lasted from a few days to weeks, at least a few times a year. My mum felt very nervous about being home alone with 2 young kids. I was 10 and my brother was 6, so we decided to get a dog. We knew we wanted a big dog, but something that would be gentle with my brother and I. After a few weeks at looking at shelters, we took home Rocky. He was 9 months when we took him home, and already pushing 70 pounds. We believe he's a German Shepherd mixed with some northern or mountain breed. We aren't sure to this day, but he's a massive red-colored dog with a long black muzzle and ears, a fluffy tail that he carries over his back, and a white stripe up his nose. It wasn't long until he was 100 pounds and an absolute force to be reckoned with. Even though he was very gentle with both my brother and I, loved our cats and was a big ball of joy to be around anyone we brought into the house, he tended to be very territorial and aggressive with other dogs and very protective of us, especially of my mum and I. Once the electric company came to do work on the telephone poles on our property without telling us first, and after 20 minutes they finally had to call us because Rocky had trapped them in their truck and was jumping up and barking at their window. I doubt he would have really attacked them if they'd have left their trucks, but it was more than enough to make them think twice. This protective instinct came in very, very handy one day. It was summertime, my dad was at work, and my mum was home with my brother and I since she was a teacher and off for the summer with us. My mum was working in our garden, and my brother and I were playing close by with Rocky watching over all of us. Rocky all of a sudden sounded the alarm, throwing his head up in the air and barking as he makes a deep woo-woo noise. I looked up to see a dirty white pickup truck off the main road into our driveway. This wasn't necessarily alarming at first, as people sometimes used our driveway to turn around when they got lost. But the white pickup slowly ambled up our drive, and I could see something strange in the bed. It was lumpy and discolored, but I couldn't really tell what it was until he pulled all the way up to our house, where our other cars were, and honked the horn to get our attention. It was meat. Giant red chunks of meat with some limbs of various animals still attached. It was the creepiest thing I'd ever seen in my life. Just a grizzled, scraggly man in his early 50s driving a pickup truck full of meat in the southern July heat. I immediately just got a really bad vibe from the guy, and I remember my mum telling my brother and I to go inside, and we did, but watched out the glass door. Rocky had surprisingly been quiet at that point, but was now next to my mum, and she had her hands around his collar. The guy rolled down the window and asked my mum if she wanted to purchase some quality meat. My mum said no, and to never visit our property again. Instead, he went on about the different types of meat and asking how much we wanted: beef, venison, pork, etc. My mum asked him to leave again, but instead he decided to get out of the nasty white pickup. As soon as his feet touched the ground, Rocky went ballistic, barking and snarling. This finally made the guy stop. He looked at Rocky, looked at my mum and asked, "Does your dog bite?" My mum, deathly serious, replied, "Only if I tell him to." The guy took one more look at Rocky, and I'm guessing decided not to mess with the giant snarling beast, got into his truck, backed up, and headed back down our driveway. I don't know if he was just trying to sell the meat or what, but apparently he'd been around to our neighbors who also had just gotten a really bad vibe from him. We'll never know what he was really doing with those giant slabs of meat in the bed of his pickup truck. Maybe he was just a weird guy out to sell some sketchy meat. Maybe he was looking for something else, but we never saw the meat man again. Rocky is still kicking it, by the way. He's almost 15 and completely deaf, but he's still out on the yard on summer days, watching over us. Where I work, it's hard to avoid people. My job is to document everyone else's work by taking photos, so a lot of people know me generally as the blonde photo girl. While shooting an event a few months ago, I found myself talking to a group of people about hobbies. I, being the anime trash that I am, mentioned conventions. This one small creepy stashed dude got all excited and said he's going to Comic-Con. I thought he was talking about the official ones, so I asked, NYC or San Diego? He said some random town in Ohio, and I said, Well, it's probably not an official Comic-Con. And he got really flustered about this and proceeded to follow me around, just saying over and over, it's a real Comic-Con. At this point, I'm annoyed as hell. I'm getting the vibes that 1, he's a creep, and 2, he's just using this as an excuse to follow me around. I tell him, hey, this conversation was over when I walked away. Why are you still hung up on it? He looked so butthurt, and he said, but it was Comic-Con. Cue earlier this week. During a break, a friend and I did a little PS Vita game trading. When we were wrapping things up, I noticed the same freaking kid at another table watching. I barely think of it, and stand up and say bye to my friend. That kid had stood up too, and walked slowly to the vending machines which I had to pass by to get to my workspace. By the time I was nearing him, he was idly standing in front of a machine, just glancing at me in the machine, not moving to buy anything either. I thought, oh great, let me guess he's gonna follow me. And I tested this by going to the store past the vending machine and down some stairs. Lo and behold, 5 seconds later he's following. And since there are no jackets allowed in store, I set this empty soda can down that I had from earlier on the ground so that I can take off my coat. He meagerly offers, I think they have a garbage bag in the store, and I reply with a little attitude, duh, there's a trash can in there. And here's where I finally decide to vent, and tell him how creepy it was that he'd followed me. I didn't follow you, he says with the guiltiest look on his face. I shut him down, and I was like, yeah, sure, I'm gonna go now. That was the last thing I said, and then I was done with that guy. I really hope he doesn't decide to pester me anymore. Creep. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. Do hope you enjoyed tonight's video. Huge thanks as always to my lovely patrons whose names can be seen on screen now. If you're interested in having your name on screen and getting extra perks for joining Patreon, you can find the link with the breakdown of prizes in the description. Thanks guys. Yeah, everything's going well over here. I hope all of you are doing good. Please follow me on Twitter because I just asked you to and it'd be pretty awesome. Trying to hit 4K, nearly there. It's a bit, we've nearly got 220,000 subscribers on the channel, and I really think more people would have followed me on Twitter really, but I don't post there that often, so there you go. In any case, thanks guys, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.